The dust-laden wind swept across Eliza O'Malley's tear-streaked face as she stood at the edge of Chico, California, one hand protectively cradling her barely swollen belly, the other clutching a small leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. The year was 1872, and at 19 years of age, she had just been cast out of her family home with nothing but shame and a growing child to keep her company. The setting sun cast long shadows across the main street as Eliza tried to gather her thoughts. Just hours ago, her father had discovered the letter she'd hidden beneath her mattress, a letter from Thomas, the traveling salesman who had promised to return for her, but never did. The letter detailed his love, their secret meetings, and inadvertently revealed the pregnancy she'd been concealing for nearly 3 months. "You've brought disgrace upon this family," her father had thundered, his face purple with rage. "No daughter of mine will remain under my roof unmarried and with child." Her mother had stood silently by, eyes downcast, offering no defense as Eliza pleaded for understanding. Her younger siblings were ushered from the room as if her condition were contagious. By nightfall, she was homeless, her name forbidden to be spoken again in the O'Malley household. Eliza wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took stock of her situation. She had $12 to her name, nowhere to sleep, and a growing hunger that gnawed at her insides. The baby fluttered within her, a gentle reminder of her responsibility. She couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. She made her way toward the center of town, hoping to find lodging for the night. Chico had grown considerably since the railroad had come through, bringing with it opportunity and expansion. Perhaps she could find work as a seamstress or in one of the hotels. The Golden Eagle Hotel stood imposingly on the corner, its windows glowing with warm light that contrasted sharply with the coldness in Eliza's heart. She hesitated at the entrance, aware that her disheveled appearance might raise questions. Before she could decide whether to enter, a group of rowdy cowboys burst through the swinging doors, their laughter dying as they spotted her. "Well, what have we here?" one of them said, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Looking for company, darlin'?" Eliza stepped back, clutching her satchel tighter. "No, sir, just seeking lodging for the night." The tallest of the group stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Ain't you Patrick O'Malley's girl? What are you doing out alone at this hour?" Before she could formulate a response, a deep voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Harmon. The lady clearly doesn't want your attention." The cowboys turned, revealing a solitary figure leaning against the hitching post. He straightened to his full height, and Eliza could see he was different from the others. His clothes weren't flashy, but practical, dusty from the trail. His eyes, even in the dim light, held a steadiness that made her breath catch. "Mind your own business, Garrett," the first cowboy growled. "We're just being neighborly." "Your kind of neighborliness isn't welcome. Move along now." The stranger's tone was calm, but carried an undercurrent of authority that made the cowboys hesitate. After a tense moment, they backed away, muttering curses as they moved down the street. The stranger approached Eliza, keeping a respectful distance. His face, now visible in the lamplight, was weathered but kind, with a strong jaw partially hidden by a neatly trimmed beard. He couldn't have been more than 25. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, removing his hat. His hair was dark, slightly too long, with a wave that spoke of time spent outdoors rather than vanity. "Yes, thank you," Eliza replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate your intervention." "Daniel Garrett," he said, giving a slight nod. "Most folks call me Dan." "Eliza O'Malley," she responded, then immediately regretted offering her surname. If word of her disgrace hadn't spread yet, it soon would. Dan's expression revealed nothing if he had heard of her situation. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight, Miss O'Malley?" The question brought tears to her eyes once more, and she blinked rapidly to dispel them. "I'm seeking accommodations. At this hour? In your condition?" His eyes briefly flickered to her midsection before returning to her face, his expression softening. "Pardon my forwardness, but I notice these things." Eliza stiffened, preparing for judgment or unwanted advances. Instead, Dan Garrett surprised her. "My ranch is about 3 miles outside of town. It's not much, but I have a spare room that's clean and warm. My front door is always open wide to those in need." He gestured to his horse, a sturdy palomino waiting patiently nearby. "No strings attached, Miss O'Malley. Just the offer of safe shelter for tonight." Eliza hesitated. She'd been raised to be cautious of strangers, particularly men. But something in Dan Garrett's straightforward manner and the gentle respect in his eyes made her consider his offer. What choice did she have? The hotels might turn her away once they realized who she was, and her funds wouldn't last long. "Why would you help me? You don't know me," she said, searching his face for ulterior motives. "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know it's getting cold. You're alone and you're expecting. Where I come from, that's reason enough." He paused, then added, "My sister was in a similar situation once. Nobody helped her. I swore I wouldn't be that person who turns away when someone needs a hand." His words rang with sincerity, and Eliza made her decision. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I accept your offer, for tonight at least." Dan nodded, seemingly pleased but not triumphant. He helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, keeping a respectful distance despite the shared saddle. As they rode out of town, Eliza felt a curious mixture of fear and hope. She had no idea what the future held, but for tonight, at least, she had shelter. The Garrett ranch came into view as they crested a small hill, a modest homestead with a main house, barn, and a few outbuildings. A dog's bark announced their arrival, and soon a large border collie bounded to meet them, circling the horse excitedly. "That's Ranger," Dan explained as he helped Eliza dismount. "He's all bark, no bite." The house was simple but well maintained. Dan lit a lamp and showed Eliza to a small but clean bedroom. "My sister's old room," he explained. "She moved to Sacramento last year. Bathroom's down the hall. There's water in the pitcher for washing up." "This is very kind," Eliza said, setting her satchel on the bed. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need," Dan replied. "Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." After he left, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. She washed her face in the cold water, changed into her nightgown, and crawled under the quilt. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she wondered what would become of her and her unborn child. The baby would arrive in winter. Would she still be welcome here? Where would she go? How would she provide? As dawn broke, Eliza woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly and followed the aroma to the kitchen, where Dan stood at the stove. "Morning," he said without turning. "Hope you're hungry." "Starving, actually," Eliza admitted, taking a seat at the table. Dan served up plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before he spoke. "So, what's your plan, Miss O'Malley?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. "I don't have one yet? My father discovered my condition yesterday and cast me out." She swallowed hard. "The baby's father was passing through town. He promised to return, but—" Dan nodded, understanding. "Men make promises they don't intend to keep." "I was foolish to believe him," Eliza said, her voice small. "No," Dan corrected her gently. "Trusting isn't foolish. Breaking trust is." He refilled her coffee cup. "You can stay here while you figure things out. I could use help around the place if you're willing. Nothing too strenuous, mind you." Eliza looked up in surprise. "You'd let me stay? A complete stranger?" Dan met her gaze steadily. "You won't be a stranger for long, and everyone deserves a second chance." The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable routine. Eliza proved to be a capable housekeeper, and despite her condition, insisted on pulling her weight. She cooked, cleaned, and even helped with lighter outdoor chores. Dan never pushed her to talk about her past, but gradually, over evening meals and quiet moments by the fire, their stories emerged. Dan had inherited the ranch from his parents, who had died in an influenza outbreak 5 years earlier. His sister, Grace, had lived with him until her marriage the previous year. He ran a modest operation, raising cattle and horses with the help of 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. "It's not a big spread," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "But it's enough. I've never been one for grand ambitions." Eliza found herself drawn to his quiet strength and unwavering integrity. Unlike most men she'd known, Dan Garrett said what he meant and meant what he said. There was no pretense, no hidden agenda. As her belly grew, so did her feelings for him. Yet she kept them carefully guarded. He had offered her sanctuary, not courtship. The last thing she wanted was to misinterpret his kindness for something more. One crisp October morning, Eliza was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders came into view, and she recognized the lead rider immediately, her father. Her heart hammered in her chest as she watched them dismount and approach the house. Dan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, his posture alert but not hostile. "Mr. O'Malley," he greeted her father with a nod. "What brings you to my ranch?" Patrick O'Malley was a stern man whose once handsome features had hardened with years of unyielding principles. His eyes barely flickered toward Eliza before focusing on Dan. "I've come about my daughter," he said, his voice clipped. "The town's talking, Garrett. They say you've taken in my disgraced girl, given her shelter. Some even suggest you're the father of her bastard." Dan's expression remained impassive. "People talk, Mr. O'Malley. Doesn't make it true." "Then why harbor her?" "What's your interest in my daughter?" "My interest is in doing what's right," Dan replied evenly. "She needed help. I offered it. Simple as that." Patrick's face flushed with anger. "Nothing simple about it. You've made yourself part of our family's shame." Eliza stepped forward, unable to remain silent. "Father, Mr. Garrett has been nothing but honorable. He's given me shelter when you cast me out. He's shown more Christian charity than—" "Don't you dare speak to me of Christian charity, girl," Patrick snapped. "You brought this on yourself with your sinful ways." Dan moved subtly, positioning himself between Eliza and her father. "Mr. O'Malley, I respect that you're her father, but this is my property, and Miss O'Malley is here under my protection. If you've come to take her home, that's between you and her. If you've come to cause trouble, I'll have to ask you to leave." Patrick's eyes narrowed. "I haven't come to take her back. That door's closed. I'm here to warn you associating with her will cost you. People in town are already talking. Businesses might become reluctant to deal with you. The church might not welcome you so warmly." "Then that's a price I'm willing to pay," Dan said calmly. "Now, unless you have business with me or kind words for your daughter, I think it's time you went on your way." The standoff lasted several tense moments before Patrick turned to his companions. "Let's go. There's nothing for us here." He mounted his horse without another glance at Eliza and rode away, the other 2 men following. Eliza stood trembling, tears streaming down her face. Dan approached her slowly, unsure if she wanted comfort or distance. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "It's not your fault," she replied, wiping her eyes. "But he's right about one thing. I've brought trouble to your door. Perhaps I should leave. Find somewhere else." "Eliza," Dan said, his use of her first name stopping her mid-sentence. "You heard what I told your father. I knew what I was doing when I offered you shelter. The opinions of small-minded people don't concern me. But your livelihood, your standing in the community, are less important than doing what's right." He hesitated, then added softly, "and less important than you." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to address. Instead, Dan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, let's go inside. It's getting cold out here." That night, Eliza lay awake, her hands resting on her swollen belly as the baby kicked vigorously. The encounter with her father had shaken her, but Dan's steadfast support had touched something deep within her. She was falling in love with him, his quiet strength, his unwavering principles, his gentle kindness. But how could she burden him further? He had already sacrificed enough on her behalf. November brought colder weather in preparation for winter. Dan hired additional help for the heavier ranch work, explaining to Eliza that he wanted to be more available as her time drew near. His consideration touched her deeply. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Dan cleared his throat nervously. "I've been thinking," he began, "about the baby." Eliza tensed, fearing he was finally going to broach the subject of her departure after the birth. "When the little one comes," he continued, "you'll both need a name, a proper surname." "Yes," she agreed cautiously. "I haven't decided whether to give the baby my name or—" "I was thinking," Dan interrupted, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "that Garrett might suit you both." Eliza's breath caught. "I don't understand." Dan set aside his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "I'm not good with fancy words or grand gestures, Eliza. But these past months having you here, it's like the house finally became a home." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife." "Dan," she whispered, "you don't have to do this. You've already done so much." "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "This is me, a man who's fallen in love with you, asking for your hand. I know it's sudden, and I know your heart might still belong to the baby's father." "No," Eliza interrupted. "Thomas was a dream, a fantasy I created. He never existed. Not really." She reached for Dan's hand. "What I feel for you is real. It's grown day by day, in quiet moments and shared work, in the way you look at me without judgment, in the respect you show me." "Is that a yes?" Dan asked, his eyes hopeful. "On one condition," Eliza replied, "that you're certain the baby isn't yours and people will talk." "Let them talk," Dan said, squeezing her hand. "The baby will be mine in all the ways that matter, and you, Eliza O'Malley, will be my wife if you'll have me." "Yes," she said, tears of joy replacing those of sorrow. "Yes, I'll have you." They were married by a justice of the peace in Sacramento 2 weeks later, away from the judgmental eyes of Chico. Dan's sister Grace stood as witness, welcoming Eliza warmly into the family. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Eliza felt true hope for the future. December arrived with unusual severity, bringing heavy snows that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Dan ensured they were well supplied, the pantry stocked, and the woodpile high. On a particularly bitter night, as wind howled around the eaves, Eliza felt the first contractions. "Dan," she called, trying to keep her voice steady, "I think it's time." The fear in her eyes matched his own, but he nodded resolutely. "I'll fetch Mrs. Cooper." The neighboring rancher's wife had experience as a midwife and had promised to attend the birth. "The snow," Eliza protested. "It's too dangerous." "I'll be careful," Dan promised, already pulling on his heavy coat. "The baby's coming early. We need her help." The next hours were a blur of pain and fear for Eliza. Dan returned with Mrs. Cooper just as her labor intensified. The older woman took charge immediately, sending Dan to boil water and prepare clean linens. "Men," Mrs. Cooper chuckled as she helped Eliza into position. "Always thinking boiled water solves everything. Don't you worry, child. You're young and strong. This baby will come just fine." The labor was long and difficult. Outside, the storm raged, mirroring Eliza's inner turmoil as she fought to bring her child into the world. Dan paced the hallway, flinching at each cry, praying as he'd never prayed before. Finally, as dawn broke and the storm subsided, a new cry pierced the air, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. "A boy," Mrs. Cooper announced, wrapping the infant in a clean blanket. "A fine, healthy boy." Dan entered the room tentatively, his eyes seeking Eliza. She lay exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but triumphant. "Come meet your son," she whispered. Dan approached the bed, gazing down at the tiny red face nested in blankets. The baby's eyes were screwed shut, his tiny fists waving in protest at the cold world he had entered. Dan reached out a finger, and the infant grasped it with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Dan said, his voice thick with emotion. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm around Eliza, the other supporting the baby she held. "What shall we call him?" Eliza looked up at the man who had saved her from despair, given her a home, his name, and now embraced her child as his own. "William," she said, "after your father." "William Daniel Garrett," Dan amended, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "A strong name for a strong boy." Mrs. Cooper discreetly left the room, leaving the new family to bond in privacy. As she closed the door, she smiled to herself. She'd attended many births in her time, but few had moved her as much as this one. The child born of one man's betrayal, now cradled in another man's love. The weeks following William's birth were challenging, but filled with joy. Dan proved to be a natural father, rising for night feedings, changing diapers with clumsy but willing hands, and spending hours simply watching the baby sleep. "I never knew I could love someone so quickly," he confessed one night as they stood over William's cradle. "He's only been here a month, but I can't imagine life without him." Eliza leaned against his solid warmth. "Thank you for giving him a home, a name." "He's my son," Dan said simply. "Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters." Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the ranch. Calves were born, crops planted, and William thrived under the loving care of his parents. Eliza regained her strength and took on more responsibilities, proving herself to be not just a good mother, but an excellent rancher's wife. One Sunday in April, Dan suggested they attend church in Chico. Eliza hesitated, remembering her father's warnings about their reception. "Are you sure?" she asked. "People will talk." "Let them," Dan replied confidently. "It's time we stopped hiding. This is our family, and I'm proud of it." The church fell silent as they entered, William nestled in Eliza's arms. She felt the weight of stairs, heard the whispers, and held her head high. Dan guided her to a pew, his hand steady at the small of her back. The service proceeded, and when it ended, they prepared to face the congregation's judgment. To their surprise, several women approached, cooing over the baby, offering congratulations. Not everyone was welcoming. Some parishioners pointedly avoided them, but it was a start. As they left the church, Eliza spotted her mother standing near the gate, her expression a mixture of longing and uncertainty. Dan noticed too and gently urged her forward. "Go on," he murmured. "She's your mother." Eliza approached cautiously, the baby in her arms serving as both shield and bridge. "Mother," Margaret O'Malley's eyes filled with tears as she gazed at her grandson. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "May I?" Eliza hesitated, then carefully transferred William to her mother's arms. The older woman cradled him expertly, her face softening with love. "I'm sorry, Eliza," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Your father, he's a proud man, too proud. But I miss you. I want to know my grandson." "His name is William," Eliza said. "William Daniel Garrett." Margaret looked up at Dan, who stood respectfully at a distance. "You've been good to my daughter, Mr. Garrett." "She's been good to me, madam," he replied. "And please call me Dan." "Your father doesn't know I'm here," Margaret continued, returning her attention to Eliza. "He wouldn't approve, but I couldn't stay away any longer." "Will you come visit us?" Eliza asked. "The ranch isn't far." Margaret handed the baby back, her eyes sad. "Not yet. Your father, he needs time. But perhaps someday." It was a small opening, a crack in the wall of rejection that had surrounded Eliza since her banishment. As they rode home, she felt a mixture of hope and sadness. "She'll come around," Dan assured her, "and maybe your father will too in time." "And if he doesn't?" Eliza asked. Dan smiled at her, his love evident in his eyes. "Then we'll be fine just as we are, you, me, and William, our family." Summer brought prosperity to the Garrett ranch. The cattle fetched good prices, and Dan's reputation as a fair dealer brought new business. Eliza expanded the kitchen garden, preserving vegetables and fruits for the coming winter. William grew steadily, a happy baby with his mother's eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. One hot August afternoon, as Eliza was hanging laundry with William sleeping in a basket nearby, A cloud of dust on the road announced visitors. Her heart jumped. Was it her father again? But as the riders came into view, she saw it was only one man, leading a pack horse laden with goods. She didn't recognize him at first, his face shadowed by his hat, but as he dismounted and approached, her blood ran cold. "Eliza," he said, removing his hat, "you're a sight for sore eyes." Thomas, the baby's father, the man who had promised to return but never did until now. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I promised I'd come back, didn't I?" he replied, his charming smile exactly as she remembered. "Took longer than I expected. Business complications." He glanced around. "Nice place. Is this your family's new home?" Before she could answer, William stirred and let out a small cry. Thomas's eyes widened as he spotted the basket. "Is that—" he began, taking a step toward the baby. "My son," Eliza said firmly, moving to stand between Thomas and William. Thomas's expression changed, calculation replacing surprise. "Our son, you mean?" He took another step forward. "I came back for you, Eliza. I'm ready to make an honest woman of you now. We can be a family, the three of us." The offer she had once dreamed of now filled her with dread. "You're too late, Thomas. I'm already married." He frowned, his handsome face darkening. "Married? To whom?" "To me?" Dan's voice came from behind them. He had approached silently, alerted by the arrival of a stranger. Now he stood tall, his expression neutral, but his eyes watchful. Thomas looked between them, understanding dawning. "I see. You didn't wait for me." "You left me alone and pregnant," Eliza replied, her voice stronger now with Dan beside her. "What did you expect?" "I expected loyalty," Thomas said, his charm evaporating. "I told you I'd return." "After 14 months?" Dan interjected. "That's a long business trip." Thomas ignored him, focusing on Eliza. "That's my child. I have rights." "You have nothing," Dan stated flatly. "William is my son legally and in every way that matters. I've been there for his first smile, his first laugh. I've walked the floor with him at night." "Where were you?" "This isn't over," Thomas threatened, backing toward his horse. "I'll be back with the law." "The law will tell you the same thing," Dan replied calmly. "William bears my name. I'm on his birth certificate. You abandoned them both." Thomas mounted his horse, his face twisted with anger. "We'll see about that." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Eliza collapsed against Dan, trembling. "He'll try to take William," she whispered. "I know him. He won't give up easily." "He won't take our son," Dan promised, his arms strong around her. "I won't let that happen." That night, after William was asleep, they discussed their options. "Maybe we should leave," Eliza suggested. "Start fresh somewhere else." Dan shook his head. "This is our home. We're not running. Besides, the law is on our side. Thomas abandoned you both. No judge would grant him custody." "But what if he lies? Claims he didn't know about the baby?" "Then we'll fight him," Dan said firmly. "Together." True to his word, Thomas returned 3 days later with the town sheriff. Dan met them in the yard, his expression resolute. "Mr. Garrett," Sheriff Mills began, clearly uncomfortable, "Mr. Reynolds here claims your wife bore his child and that you're preventing him from seeing his son." "My wife and I have been married since November," Dan replied evenly. "Our son William was born in December. Mr. Reynolds abandoned my wife when she was with child and made no attempt to contact her until now." The sheriff turned to Thomas. "Is this true? You knew she was expecting?" Thomas hesitated. I suspected. But I had business that couldn't wait. I always intended to return." "After 14 months, Dan pointed out again. "Meanwhile, I've raised William as my own. My name is on his birth certificate." The sheriff scratched his head. "Well, Mr. Reynolds, it seems to me that Mr. Garrett has established himself as the boy's father, legally speaking. If you want to pursue custody, you'd need to take it to a judge." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "Fine, I'll do exactly that. I'll prove he's mine." After they left, Eliza paced anxiously. What if he convinces a judge? What if they take William from us? Dan gathered her in his arms. That won't happen. We'll get a lawyer if necessary. 2 weeks passed without word from Thomas. Eliza began to hope he'd given up, but Dan remained vigilant. Then one evening, as they sat down to dinner, a knock came at the door. Dan answered it to find a well-dressed man holding a leather portfolio. "Mr. Garrett, I'm Benjamin Wells, attorney at law. May I come in?" Dan led him to the parlor, where Eliza waited with William on her lap. The lawyer nodded politely to her before opening his portfolio. "I represent Thomas Reynolds," he began. "My client wishes to establish his paternity of the child and secure visitation rights." "No," Eliza said immediately. "He abandoned us. He has no rights." The lawyer gave her a sympathetic look. "Mrs. Garrett, I understand your feelings, but biologically speaking, Mr. Reynolds is the child's father. The law recognizes certain rights." "What exactly does he want?" Dan asked. "Initially, supervised visits. Eventually, he hopes to share custody." "Absolutely not," Eliza declared. "William doesn't know him. He's a stranger." Mr. Wells sighed. "Mrs. Garrett, I must advise you that fighting this in court could become unpleasant. Details of your past would become public record, the circumstances of the child's conception, your unwed status at the time of birth. These matters would be discussed openly." "Are you threatening my wife?" Dan's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Not at all," the lawyer replied smoothly, "merely outlining the reality of legal proceedings. However, there is another option." He extracted a document from his portfolio. "Mr. Reynolds is prepared to relinquish all claims to the child in exchange for compensation." "He's selling his son?" Eliza was appalled. "He's acknowledging the reality that the child is bonded with Mr. Garrett," Wells corrected. "He's willing to step aside for a price." "How much?" Dan asked bluntly. $500. It was a substantial sum, nearly half of what the ranch had earned that year. Dan and Eliza exchanged glances. "We need time to consider," Dan said finally. "Of course." The lawyer stood, leaving the document on the table. "Mr. Reynolds leaves for San Francisco in 2 weeks. He'd like this resolved before then." After he left, Eliza burst into tears. "He's trying to extort us, using our son as leverage." Dan held her, his mind working. "We could pay him," he said slowly. "We'd have to sell some cattle, maybe take a loan against next year's profits. But we could do it." "And what happens when he comes back next year? Demands more money?" Eliza pulled away, pacing angrily. "No, I won't have William growing up under that shadow." "What do you suggest?" Eliza stopped, her expression hardening with resolve. "We fight him, in court if necessary. I won't hide anymore. I won't be ashamed. If he wants to drag my name through the mud, so be it. I'll tell the truth that he seduced me, promised marriage, then disappeared without a trace." Dan's eyes shone with pride. "Are you sure? It won't be easy." "I'm sure," Eliza replied. "William deserves better than a father who would sell him. He already has a real father, you." The next morning, they rode into town to consult with James Harper, the only other lawyer in Chico. After hearing their story, Harper agreed to represent them. "It won't be pleasant," he warned, echoing Wells's words. "But I believe we have a strong case. Mr. Garrett has established himself as the child's father, and Mr. Reynolds clearly abandoned both mother and child." The days that followed were tense as they prepared their case. Then, unexpectedly, Sheriff Mills arrived at the ranch. "Thought you should know," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Eliza. "Thomas Reynolds was arrested last night in Sacramento. Seems he's wanted in 3 states for fraud and confidence schemes. He won't be bothering you folks anytime soon." Relief washed over them like a cool wave. "Is it over?" Eliza asked, hardly daring to hope. "Looks that way," the sheriff replied. "He'll be facing prison time. By the time he gets out, your boy will be grown." That night, as they lay in bed, Dan pulled Eliza close. "I was thinking," he said softly, "perhaps it's time we made William a big brother or sister." Eliza turned to face him, her heart full. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." The years passed, bringing both joy and hardship. The ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding to include more cattle and horses. William grew into a sturdy boy with his mother's quick mind and his father's steady temperament. In the spring of 1875, he was joined by a sister, Grace Margaret Garrett, named for Dan's sister and Eliza's mother. Margaret O'Malley became a regular visitor to the ranch, arriving first in secret but eventually with Patrick's reluctant knowledge. The elder O'Malley remained estranged from his daughter, his pride preventing reconciliation. But when William was 5, a drought brought financial ruin to many local farmers, including Patrick. Dan heard about the O'Malley's plight and rode to their farm, offering help. Patrick initially refused, but necessity eventually overcame pride. The two men worked side by side to save what they could of the harvest, and in that shared labor, a tentative respect developed. On William's 6th birthday, Patrick and Margaret attended the celebration at the ranch, the first time Patrick had set foot on the property. He watched his grandson blow out the candles, saw how the boy looked up to Dan with adoration, and something in his hard heart softened. "You've done well," he told Eliza as they stood watching the children play. "Your husband is a good man, better than I gave him credit for." It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. Over time, the rift between father and daughter slowly healed. Patrick never explicitly acknowledged his wrongdoing in casting her out, but his actions helping with the ranch, teaching William to fish, bouncing baby Grace on his knee spoke louder than words. In 1878, Eliza gave birth to twin boys, Robert and James, completing their family. The Garrett Ranch became known throughout the region for its hospitality, its fair dealing, and the strong family at its heart. Visitors were often told the story of how Dan and Eliza met, how her family had banished her for unwed pregnancy shame, and how a cowboy had said, "My front door is always open wide." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dan surprised Eliza with a new house larger, more comfortable, built with the prosperity their hard work had earned. But he kept the old house standing. "Why not tear it down?" Eliza asked as they stood on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set over the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to beloved partners. Dan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Because that house is where our story began, where I found the courage to open my door, and you found the courage to walk through it." He turned her gently to face him. "And because someday, someone else might need a door that's always open wide." Eliza reached up to touch his face, still handsome after all these years, now marked with lines of laughter around his eyes and mouth. "I love you, Daniel Garrett. Every day I thank God for bringing me to your door." "And I thank him for giving me the wisdom to open it," Dan replied, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that held all the tenderness and passion of their enduring love. As twilight deepened into night, they walked hand in hand back to their home, where their children slept safely under a roof, made strong by love, acceptance, and the courage to keep a door and a heart open wide. In the years that followed, the Garrett family continued to thrive. William grew into a thoughtful young man who inherited his father's integrity and his mother's compassion. At 18, he left for college in San Francisco, the first in either family to pursue higher education. Grace developed a talent for music, filling the house with piano melodies that drew neighbors from miles around for impromptu gatherings. The twins, as different as brothers could be, brought constant energy and occasional chaos to the household. James, with his inventive mind always dreaming up new contraptions, Robert with his natural affinity for animals and the land. Dan and Eliza's love deepened with each passing season, weathering the inevitable storms of life drought, years that tested their resilience, illnesses that brought fear but ultimately strengthened their bond, disagreements that taught them the art of compromise. On William's 21st birthday, as the family gathered to celebrate, Dan raised his glass in a toast. "To William," he said, his voice thick with emotion, My son in every way that matters. You've made us proud." Later that evening, as the younger children went to bed and the adults lingered over coffee, William cleared his throat nervously. "There's something I'd like to say," he began. "All my life, I've known the story of how you two met, how Mom was cast out by her family, and Dad offered shelter when no one else would." Eliza and Dan exchanged glances, wondering where this was leading. "What I didn't fully understand until recently," William continued, "was the courage that took from both of you. Mom, to trust a stranger when you'd been betrayed. Dad, to open your home and your heart, knowing what people would say." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I'm proud to bear your name, Dad. Proud to be your son. And when I have children someday, I'll teach them what you taught me, that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, acceptance, and doors that remain open when others close." There wasn't a dry eye at the table as Dan embraced his son, no words necessary between them. That night, as Eliza and Dan prepared for bed, she noticed him standing at the window, gazing out at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. Dan slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "About how differently things might have turned out. If I hadn't been in town that night, if you'd gone somewhere else, if I'd listened to the gossips instead of my heart." "But you were there," Eliza said softly. "And you did listen to your heart. That's who you are, Daniel Garrett, a man whose door and heart is always open wide." He turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his calloused hand. "I've never regretted it, not for a single moment." "Nor have I," Eliza replied, leaning into his touch. "Every day with you has been a gift." As they stood together in the quiet darkness, the house around them filled with the peaceful breathing of their sleeping children, both reflected on the long journey that had brought them here from a chance meeting on a dusty street to this rich life they'd built together. A life founded not on perfect beginnings but on perfect acceptance, not on flawless pasts, but on a flawless love that had room enough for all the imperfections that made them human. And in that moment, as in countless moments before, they were grateful for the circumstances that had led a banished young woman to the doorstep of a man whose heart was as open as the California sky above them, endless, embracing, and filled with light.